Greetings to all the viewers from across the world. A very warm welcome to this international seminar on Chinese involvement in Sri Lanka, organized by Tillotoma Foundation. I am Tanisha Acharya from Tillotoma Foundation. Tillotoma Foundation is a global think tank working in the areas of international relations, area studies, financial, environmental, scientific, strategic, and defense policy. The distinguished speakers at this international seminar are Ambassador Dr. Dayan Jayatilika, former Ambassador of Sri Lanka to Russian Federation, France, and the United Nations in Geneva; Dr. Dilin Pathirana, Senior Lecturer, Faculty of Law, University of Colombo, Sri Lanka; Dr. Tulani Atanayake, Research Fellow, Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore. Today's discussion will be chaired and moderated by Ambassador Ruchi Ghanshyam, former Secretary, Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India, and former High Commissioner of India to the United Kingdom. Thank you all for being here with us at this discussion. Audience members may feel free to send in questions or comments. Let me now hand over the session to Ambassador Ruchi Ghanshyam. Ma'am.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot. And I think it's a really interesting afternoon that we can look forward to for this international seminar on Chinese involvement in Sri Lanka, which has been organized very thoughtfully by the Tillotoma Foundation. And to speak are really stalwarts, knowledgeable experts, and I'm really looking forward to hearing them. We have, of course, as mentioned, Ambassador Dayanjaya Tileka, Dr. Dilini Patirana, and Dr. Chulani Atanaike, all very well versed in these issues, and we can expect a very fruitful and engaging discussion. I will not take too much of your time because we have such eminent people to speak on the subject. Just briefly, to give a perspective that Sri Lanka has long-standing close ties with China, as it has, of course, with a number of countries in the neighborhood as well as globally. The mission, Chinese mission in Sri Lanka and China, the diplomatic relations were established in February 1957. Number of agreements and visits have been exchanged between the two countries, which have brought the relationship even closer. Off and on, there are some comments that one can read in the media about Sri Lankan ties being too close to the Chinese, but that is comments in the media. I would leave it to the eminent panel that we have to debate that question. The Colombo Port City Economic Commission Act, which is also part of today's discussion, in the context of which I think recent developments can be discussed, is again something for which I would leave it to the experts to elucidate. But suffice it to add that the act itself, as I found on the net, has been termed controversial by many observers. It is supposed to be developed into a hub of economic activity, increase employment, generate new jobs or job opportunities, and economic prosperity for Sri Lanka and for the people of Sri Lanka. But the questions that are being asked about it pertain to, for instance, the land being given on lease to a foreign entity, how much of control the government or the legal system of Sri Lanka will have on it, whether this will create a kind of a geostrategic competition and put Sri Lanka in the middle of something that it would want to avoid. These are some of the questions that are being raised. There are also questions about how much of economic benefit will actually accrue to Sri Lanka. For instance, if it is to be developed as a financial hub, how much of capability existing for for making it into a financial hub are already there in Sri Lanka, and how much would be the external influence that would be part of it? These are also the questions that have been raised. Questions have also been raised about the employment opportunities that are likely to be created on the ground, that the Sri Lankan youth will have to develop the skills for them before they can apply, which means that possibility of foreign nationals getting the high paid jobs cannot be ruled out. So these are again issues that are being raised. The other issue is that the Chinese companies that undertake projects in foreign countries, and perhaps Sri Lankan experience has also shown that is that a number of jobs, actually lock, stock, and barrel almost, goes to the country of which is financing the project, and very little benefit other than, of course, the development of infrastructure that accrues to the benefiting country. So in that context, the question is being raised about how many jobs would actually get generated for Sri Lanka. uh, Again, the question about whether uh, this would actually not become a strategic element of China's outreach to the world, because it wants to see itself as a maritime power, and it would help to have uh, places where some kind of a base, not a base, actually base is the wrong word, but some facilities can be available, and whether this would not become something of that nature. Another comment that I have seen is, and I have heard over the years, is about the debt trap that generally comes from Chinese assistance or Chinese aided projects. That the projects don't necessarily give the benefits that are supposedly envisaged before the project is actually put into place, and the debt therefore then becomes somewhat unsustainable, making long-term uh, making the country beholden to as a debtor to China in the long run. So these are some of the questions. One that I mean, there are other questions, but I think I don't want to go too much into the detail myself. I would much rather that we hear from our eminent panel on this. Apart from, of course, the very interesting geostrategic background in which we are discussing, we have the Quad, we have the G7 meeting that recently happened, and we have such wide experience amongst our three panelists that I think we will leave all that to them. So with that, may I welcome you, Ambassador, and request you to lead the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, please.
Yes. Well, I have concerns about the stepping up of China's involvement in Sri Lanka, not because I'm in any way anti-Chinese. I have enormous respect for China's role in world affairs and the role of the Chinese Communist Party. But as a realist, I have very serious concerns as to whether Sri Lanka has lost its sense of balance and therefore lost its way in external affairs to an extent that it is to our detriment. That is one point. The second point is that China itself is showing signs of what in the old days it would itself term adventurism. The pace and trajectory and the nature of Chinese behavior has changed drastically over at least the last 2 years. Now, putting the two together, my question as to whether Sri Lanka has tilted too much in the direction of China, and what I notice about China's own behavior in world affairs, I think that Sri Lanka has let itself be drawn in to mounting great power rivalry, and we're making a mistake in doing so. Now, China and Sri Lanka have always been close. During the war that ended, China and India were very helpful to Sri Lanka in strategic and diplomatic matters. But what we see now is a Sri Lankan tilt towards China, which goes way beyond that which Sri Lanka has engaged in at any time in the past. And by the past, I go back to the period of Premier Zhou Enlai, the Bandaranayakas, and later Chandrika Kumaratunga, before that President Premadasa. Successive administrations have had very good relations with China. But there is something new under the incumbent administration. Sri Lanka has always been very conscious that systemically we are a multi-party democracy. We are very proud of the fact, or we have been very proud of the fact, that we are Asia's oldest democracy. And if you broaden the horizon, we are the oldest democracy in the Afro-Asian continents. So therefore, neither Sri Lanka nor China ever approached that boundary or that firewall of confusing the systemic with the diplomatic and interstate relationship. But under our present administration, there are new signs. President Rajapaksa, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, in his conversations with President Xi, has said, and here I rely on the reports or the statements issued by the Embassy of China and referred to by the Chinese ambassador in Colombo rather than any other less objective source. Our president has twice referred to the governance experience of the Communist Party of China. Now, as I said, I'm an admirer of the Chinese Communist Party, but that's as far as its historical contribution has been to the Chinese people and to the unity of China. But Sri Lanka has never, at the level of our head of state, made an outreach beyond our relationship with the People's Republic of China to refer to the governance experience of the Communist Party of China. There are two versions of this, both in statements of the ambassador of China in Colombo. One uses the term that the president of Sri Lanka spoke of his earnest his wish to learn from the governance experience of the Communist Party of China, and the other actually uses a slightly different terminology, which says to learn the governance experience of the Communist Party of China. Now that's a straying into the area of systems, crossing the firewall at a time of contemporary history, where the United States, certainly under President Joe Biden, has put the issue of democracy versus authoritarianism, or democracy versus autocracy, as they call it, front and center in what is the new global contestation. Now, it's the wrong time for Sri Lanka to be seen and heard to be tampering with that systemic firewall. In terms of the influence of external powers in Sri Lanka, we have this usual paradox, but that's characteristic of small island nations. On the one hand, there's an allergy to perceived excessive intrusiveness. On the other hand, as an island, we are always susceptible to and are shaped by external influences. Now, it is very important to manage that dialectic And Sri Lanka used to be able to do that. We were ambidextrous. I mean, call it non-alignment, but it was really the capacity for ambidexterity. We deviated from that in the 1980s to our detriment, because we were not sufficiently realistic about India's own threat perceptions in what India perceives as its traditional sphere of influence. Now, I fear that we are making the same mistake again, though India has been extraordinarily understated, unlike in the 1980s, in its expressions of concern. But when, at a time that India and China have had at least one incident in Ladakh of lethal friction causing casualties, and when there are Indian perceptions of Chinese build-up on its northern tier, the construction in Bhutan being one of the latest signs of it. Sri Lanka, India's only neighbor really, apart from Maldives, on the southern flank, permitting an excessive degree of influence of China, an excessively large Chinese footprint cannot but eventually trigger concerns of a geostrategic nature in India. And I don't think that that is something that is helpful to Sri Lanka, especially, I mean, that would be the case at any time. But especially when there's a global situation in which the United States, which is now resurgent, perhaps not as much as it would like to think it is, but it is resurgent in the post-Trump period, is leading a new constellation or coalescence of forces, and will view developments in the Indian Ocean as part of the Indo-Pacific with greater and greater concern. Now, China's port city, I'm not in any way an economics or financial expert, but I am struck by the fact that outside of the South China Sea, this is a place where there's an artificial island that has been built by China. And it has a preponderance of influence on that artificial island. And indeed, in terms of external players, if you look at it in the whole Yalta sense of sphere of influence, China is unmistakably the highest profile and most influential external player in Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka, as President Rajapaksa addressing the Sri Lanka Investment Forum pointed out recently, is adjacent to very, very important underwater cables through which terabytes of data flow. That's something that's not often talked about, but there we have it from the president. And of course, it is on India's southern flank. Whether India is comfortable with what's happening on its northern flank and potential dual use of certain spaces by China on its southern flank is something that we will have to wait and see. But I think it's a gamble that Sri Lanka should not have risked. We could have done it better. Once the American ambassador expressed concerns about the port city, I don't see why we couldn't sit the Americans and the Japanese and everybody down or have bilateral discussions and then work in some of those concerns into the final patterning of the legislation concerning the port city. But we seem to, under the present administration, seem to be moving unilaterally. And if there's anything bilateral in our relationships, it seems to be overwhelmingly with China. It's as if the Sri Lankan authorities think that whatever the Americans may think, whatever the Indians may think, whatever the Quad may think, there will be no consequences for us because China is on the ascendancy. And all our eggs have now been put in the Chinese basket. I'm not happy with that assumption. I don't think it will take us in the right direction or serve our national interest well. Do I have more time, or have I exhausted my time? Sorry.
If you still have a bit of your presentation to make, then we could continue for a couple of minutes more and then come back
Yes,
to it. Yeah,
just one more point.
yeah.
Now, I don't think the blame is entirely that of Sri Lanka, nor entirely that of China. I mean, China will move in its own interests where and when it can. And external relations, like nature, abhors a vacuum. What does concern me is that Ladakh being obviously a case in point, there's been a change in Chinese behavior. Earlier, the BRI was to do the job of projecting China's power and influence, and we were fine with that because it gives us economic options we didn't otherwise have. Just as I'm happy with the B3W idea, because the more options Sri Lanka has, the better. But the hard power factor has kicked in China's relations with Malaysia, with the Philippines, independent-minded Asian countries, and of course India. Now, it's true, India is a member of the Quad, but India is also a member of the SCO and of BRICS. And having served in Russia until, well, 1.5 years ago, I know how important the RIC concept, Russia, India, China, was for Moscow. Now that lies in tatters as a result of what happened in Ladakh, and whoever was responsible for it, I don't see why China did not use diplomacy, preemptive diplomacy at the highest levels to avoid such a situation. So I'm concerned about this tendency I see in the last 2 years in China's external relations. And knowing the history of the Chinese Communist Party as I do, I know that there are phases of acceleration which are later subject to self-criticism and rectification. So maybe, I'm sure they'll be back on track. But I don't want Sri Lanka to be caught in the crossfire before China rectifies its line. I don't want us to get carried away with the hubris that China is displaying. The Chinese hubris together with Sri Lankan hubris could lead a small island like ours into a situation that I think would be strategically untenable. After all, China is very far away. And unlike in the case of Myanmar or Pakistan, there's no contiguity. And this is something I'm afraid our leadership doesn't seem to be taking into account. One final point, as I said, I don't blame the Chinese. The Chinese have had very high-level exchanges or interactions with Sri Lanka. President Xi himself, 2 telephone conversations. Yang Jiechi, the top official of the Chinese Communist Party on international relations. The Chinese defense minister has visited. I don't see that level of interaction, apart from Foreign Minister Dr. Jaishankar's visit, with Sri Lanka. Now, the Sri Lankan leadership, therefore, is open only to one point of view, because India's concerns, if there are any, have not been communicated with that level of frequency at that high level. So I would just leave you with this one idea, whether it is time for India to go back to a diplomatic mechanism it used in the 1980s, and which President Joe Biden is using now concerning the Middle East and Iran and so on and so forth, and that is the appointment of a special envoy, a prime ministerial special envoy for Sri Lanka. There are, of course, many ministers. There are at least 2 ministers who are completely conversant with Sri Lanka, and they would be able to choose the right person from the system, from within the system for the task. Both Dr. Jaishankar and Minister Hardeep Puri, I mean, extraordinarily familiar. But perhaps it is necessary for the Sri Lankan leadership to be periodically briefed about India's point of view, India's concerns, through the mechanism of a special envoy, because China has been leading into it, and I don't criticize China for doing that. They obviously feel Sri Lanka is sufficiently important to have such high level interaction, and perhaps it's time for India to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. That was really a panoramic view and a brilliant analysis, if I may say so.
Thank you.
You used some very interesting, I should say, a non-cliched kind of terminology. I rather liked the way you use the word ambidextrosity in terms of Sri Lanka's foreign policy. That was really, and you made a very good, also an interesting suggestion about, appointment of special envoys. So I think that's already a good
Yes.
start to our discussion. Uh, may I
Thank you.
invite you, Dr. Patirana, for your presentation now? We really look forward to hearing from you as well. I'm sure Ambassador is waiting to hear from you as well. Over to
Thank
you.
you. Am I audible and visible?
Yes.
Am I audible and visible?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Greetings to you all, and thank you very much for the invitation to be one of the speakers in this international seminar on Chinese involvement in Sri Lanka, which I believe topical as well as critical. Before continue, I need to emphasize the fact that during this discussion, I express my views and opinions as an independent academic. They do not represent the view of the University of Colombo or the Faculty of Law where I currently work, nor they support or oppose any local or foreign government or a political party at large. Having said that, let me clarify the parameters of my talk. This is because, to me, the phraseology of Chinese involvement in Sri Lanka is broad enough to accommodate many aspects of Sino-Sri Lanka relations from both positive and negative perspectives. However, given my background in international investment law, I will focus on Chinese investment in Sri Lanka, which has gained much attention during the recent past. What is the primary sector in which China invests in Sri Lanka, and how these investments have shaped the domestic political circumstances and outcomes in the recent past? Why have the Chinese investment in Sri Lanka become so problematic for other regional counterparts and global superpowers? These are the issues that I want to highlight during my talk, which will be eventually pinpoint Sri Lanka's perspective of Chinese investment, which I believe that considerably lacks in the contemporary discourse on Chinese involvement in Sri Lanka. So let me start by evoking the fact that over the past decades, there has been an increased Chinese presence in Sri Lanka's economic sphere, mainly through large-scale infrastructure development projects. Needless to say that developing physical infrastructure facilities is given topmost priority in Sri Lanka's post-war development agenda, with the vision to make Sri Lanka a critical link between East and West as a regional, commercial, and logistic hub. This vision, in my view or my opinion, readily fused with the China's Belt and Road Initiative. Of course, there are different narratives, but according to the China's narrative, her vision for regional integration expected to be accomplished by creating an extensive network of infrastructure, among other things such as increased trade relations. So, as a result of this combination, of course, complemented by several other national and international factors, China became the main donor, lender, as well as investor who financed Sri Lanka's major development projects such as airports, seaports, roads, power plants, so on and so forth. Indeed, most of these projects were financed by Chinese loans, yet some of them are direct Chinese investment initiated with or without local collaboration. Among the projects that are funded by loans, Hambantota Seaport and Matala International Airport become economically unviable undertakings, which encumbered Sri Lanka with a massive amount of loan commitments towards China. Similarly, the major Chinese direct investment in Sri Lanka, known as the Colombo Port City project, became highly disputed due to its initial legal arrangement, which agreed to provide the Chinese investor with land hold on a freehold basis from the land created by reclaiming the sea near the Colombo port. As such, this project subjected to increased criticisms as a threat to Sri Lanka's sovereignty, its national security, as well as security in the Indian Ocean region at large. These allegations, among others, considerably discredited the former woven Mahinda Rajapaksa administration while maturing into heated political debates, especially in the 2015 Sri Lanka's election campaigns. Of course, the opposition capitalized on this allegation and promised to revive this investment under its administration, and as a result, the project was unilaterally suspended by the Good Governance Administration in 2015 and subsequently revised the initial legal arrangement in order to provide the investor only with leasehold right for the 116 hectares of marketable land from the landfill instead of freehold rights as agreed at the initial agreement. So the current Rajapaksa administration, headed by the Gotabaya Rajapaksa, recently decided to transform the Colombo port city into a special economic zone in which investors are welcome across the globe, of course. However, an unprecedented public demonstration erupted against this arrangement, alleging that this zone would be a Chinese colony that is not subject to Sri Lanka's territorial sovereignty, while questioning how this arrangement would provide the Sri Lankan people with the benefit of this massive project. The political impact of these concerns over the fate of the current Rajapaksa administration remains to be seen. However, in my opinion, such concerns have impaired the Sri Lankan people's confidence in the current Rajapaksa administration, which came to power guaranteeing to protect Sri Lanka's national properties from acquisition by foreign powers detrimental to the country's national interest. So, the political saga of Colombo Port City project, which I explained very briefly, demonstrate how this Chinese investment has been indirectly shaping Sri Lanka's political circumstances and outcomes in the recent past, while indicating the emergent trends towards exploiting foreign investment as an electoral issue. Similarly, Chinese funded infrastructure development projects in Sri Lanka, of course, one of the strategic islands in the Indian Ocean, have been of particular concern to nations who have interest in this region, such as the USA, Japan, India, and Australia. This is mainly because Chinese funded and driven infrastructure projects in Sri Lanka have been widely seen as vital in establishing China's foothold in the Indian Ocean. They have been further expounded as essential gateways which provide China with access to important checkpoints in the Indian Ocean. As such, Chinese investment in Sri Lanka has become particularly problematic due to China's increased presence in the Indian Ocean region through Sri Lanka's infrastructure development projects, mainly seaports. As well explained in the recent literature, this scenario has given rise to several individual and joint policy measures which are aimed at preventing China from being the single power that dominates the Indian Ocean region and counterbalancing China's already realized strategic influence in the region. These emerging policy measures, mainly infrastructure development schemes driven by countries like Japan and the USA, demonstrate the increased geopolitical significance of infrastructure investment, and in my view, they have given to rise to an investment war in which Sri Lanka has already become a battlefield for infrastructure investment projects driven by subtle non-commercial policy objectives rather than profit-oriented goals. So, in conclusion, I observe that this scenario has posed Sri Lanka with several challenges to safeguard her sovereignty, national security, while strictly maintaining a non-aligned foreign policy. It is essential that Sri Lanka become a neutral destination for foreign investment driven by non-commercial policy objectives to prevent Sri Lanka from being a victim in the emergent investment war among the nations who want to check China's BRI initiative and its increased presence in the Indian Ocean region. This is because foreign investment, especially in the strategic sectors such as infrastructure, has become a robust foreign policy tool by which great powers can strengthen their political and diplomatic ties with strategically essential but small developing nations like Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Patirana. That was a very good overview and a broad brush of all the special issues, the legal points of view that you have been able to bring to bear. I particularly like the pithy conclusion that you have arrived at about challenges to Sri Lankan sovereignty, national security, and to its non-aligned policy. All of these have to be guarded against. I think that was the crux of your presentation, which also brings out the various legal aspects involved with leasing out long-term, Sri Lankan territory to a foreign company. So I think you in a way supplemented what Ambassador had said earlier, and I think it kind of two together make a wholesome presentation. So now we look forward to Dr. Atanaike. Welcome, Dr. Atanaike. I'm eager to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Ambassador Ganesham. And it was definitely two brilliant presentations. And I think my task is partly done. And also, I'm challenged. I'm trying to think what are the new factors that I can include to this discussion. So I think I agree with both Ambassador Jayatilaka and Dr. Dilini, and I echo that it is not the right time for Sri Lanka to get involved in or get in the middle of a power struggle, which is not which should be away from our shores. And having said that, I think that for the past, I think I'm not wrong to say that for a decade or so, now Sri Lanka and China's relationship has become the most discussed asymmetric relationship in the world since early 2000s. So I think from my observations, personal observations, I believe there are both domestic factors in Sri Lanka and China, as well as there are international factors, some which were already mentioned by previous speakers. Domestically, I think again it was mentioned that how China's investment became paramount for post-war constructions in Sri Lanka. So after the war, there was that opened an opportunity for China to come and invest in Sri Lanka, both due to political will and because of the investment needs. I think that is one factor that we have to consider. There were with the way the war was militarily ended. Sri Lanka had to face other challenges internationally, which eventually led for some sort of an isolation, and that led Sri Lanka to look for other options in order to fulfill its investment requirements. And also, there are two other factors I think we don't sort of discuss in the public sphere. One is that this is the same period that China gained membership in the WTO. With that, China expanded its outreach to the regions that it was not investing or active before through its state-owned enterprises, and South Asia and Sri Lanka fell into that context. Secondly, this was the same period that financial recession happened worldwide. So there was obviously the West had difficulties in providing finances. So it was more of how the financial needs were met. That is one point I think I can add to the discussion. The second factor is that how this whole focus on China Sri Lanka relationship is partly because of the rise of China. Because I think today, because China is the hot topic, China is scrutiny observed. Whatever China does in every country gets so much attention. So the fact that China is investing in Sri Lanka, or China's engagement in Sri Lanka has increased, has gained a lot of attention internationally. So this is because of the this is because based on these factors that we hear a lot about Sri Lanka falling into a debt trap, and Sri Lanka's um, involvement in the Sri Lanka's acceptance to get involved in the BRI has got a lot of attention internationally, even though we see that countries like, say, Nepal or Bangladesh are doing the same thing. So, for instance, in South Asia, I think the countries like Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka see China as a economic partner or a financial provider. Because the country which has money to invest in the kind of infrastructure need that these countries have. And if you, I think this several reports recently have highlighted the fact that the amount of Chinese funding in Sri Lanka is not even close to the amount of funding that is being done in Bangladesh or Nepal. That is a fact. And also there are increasing number of academic papers coming out about the debt trap factor also, where they say that Chinese debt trap, Sri Lanka's debt problem, when you analyze it at a macroeconomic level, has very little to do with China, but it is more to do with financial mismanagement, and also borrowings from the sovereign, commercial borrowings from the private markets. So I think these factors show us a contradictory picture about all the argumentative picture about Chinese involvement in Sri Lanka, and what China is doing. So, having said that, I would like to highlight that I totally agree that it is not the time for Sri Lanka to get involved in a power struggle because we are a small country. In fact, it is a time for us to see how we can get the benefit out of it. If we look at the foreign policy of Sri Lanka for the past so many decades, I'm sorry if I'm not agreeing with Ambassador Jayatilaka on this. We have not been a non-aligned foreign. We have not had a non-aligned foreign policy as per se, but we were more like a strategic hedging. We were hedging strategically between the countries who had competing powers, and we gained so much out of it. And even during this same period, we see the same thing. So, for instance, especially where between because of the competition between China and India, Sri Lanka has benefited so much economically. You see that there is there is what you call a pattern in which the how the trade of Sri Lanka increases with India, and in parallel to how it grows with China. The more Chinese investment come, the more Indian investment has came to Sri Lanka. So personally, as a small country, I think we say that neutrality, yeah, in international relations theory, we say that small countries have very little options when it comes to its foreign policy. The best option is to say neutral, and or be a go into alliance, what they call strategic maneuvering. So I think in that case, if you since we have benefited so much, rather than tilting to one side or the other, best option for us to at the moment is to see what are the interests of Sri Lanka and how we are going to make use of this situation for our benefit. If for having if India wants to invest in Sri Lanka, why not? Why do we have to sort of argue about it? We can invite them. What we have to make is a environment that is conducive for any country to come and invest in Sri Lanka, to come and do trade, have a partnership with Sri Lanka. So, since the Colombo port city is one of the factors that we are discussing today, I think Dr. Dilini gave a very comprehensive um, uh, overview of what is happening and the investment climate of this. Personally, I think one thing I want to highlight is that by arguing about all the strategic issues associated with this, we also forget some of the other issues that we that we have domestically. For instance, I think Ambassador Ganesham raised this question at the beginning of the discussion, like whether Sri Lanka has a skilled workforce to cater to the services that will come into this port city, whether whether our business community, our entrepreneurs are ready to provide the services. For instance, let's say like food or the meat and fish, those kind of products for the community that will come and live in this city, because they are going to be living a upscale life. So we have to be able to give them an internationally high quality product. So I think amidst all the involvements, we completely forget about these aspects, because in the port city is there now. So what Sri Lanka should be focusing on, how to make use of it, how to attract the investors, how while providing a conducive climate investment climate for them, by providing them a political stability which would make give them the assurance that their investment is worthy enough, that improving our services to meet the demand that would be coming in another decade or so. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think you were being rather modest at the beginning of your presentation. That you have no more points to add, because I think you have taken us in another kind of another direction of this topic, and you did a fairly comprehensive job as well. With some, I think there are some remarks that provoke further discussion, in fact. And I'm sure that our other two eminent panelists are just about rearing to start challenging some of the concepts that you brought into the discussion. One thing I personally didn't follow very well was the link that you made with rising Chinese economic generosity, I should say, with Chinese membership of WTO. I think I probably missed your argument. So if you don't mind just expanding a little bit on that.
Yes. What I meant was it was in 2001 that China became a full member of WTO. With that, I think the way the ability for them to invest and do trade
Okay.
relations with other countries completely changed. So they
Yeah.
started reaching out to areas that they were not very active. I think prior to
Okay.
that, apart from its neighborhood, it was more active in Africa. But now we see a lot in South Asia.
Hmm. Thank you. That's a very interesting element that you bring in. How the Chinese position, the way it changed. At the same time, the economic situation in the West also changed, and the two kind of that confluence of that moment started. Well, that's an interesting thought. Let's see. We have now the floor open for questions from the audience. But I thought, since while we wait for any other questions to come up, one of the things that that you talked about, Dr. Chilani, which perhaps Ambassador Jay Tilake can answer or expand on, rather, not answer, is that when you talked of, for instance, the advantage to Sri Lanka in terms of how much external assistance that has come into China, come into Sri Lanka from China, I think the point that perhaps needs to be also looked at is the ones that have not come, rather. The project that the US, I think it was a $450 million project that didn't happen or was cancelled. And then also there was this Indo-Japanese project that was also not continued or cancelled. So perhaps that is something a little bit of an expansion. Any of you would like to speak on that? Maybe good. And we have a question as well. If you can see the question, one of you could take up that question next. Who would like
Yes,
to? Yeah,
yes,
Ambassador.
I'd like to go on that.
Yeah.
We have to establish a level playing field, and I don't think that either the port city or investment decisions in general, or receptivity to investment decisions, demonstrates such a level playing field. The Japanese are a very good example. Um, I understand why Sri Lanka recoiled from the MCC, that is the American Millennium Challenge Cooperation Agreement, but it's very difficult to understand why the new Sri Lankan government pulled the plug on the Japanese light rail project. One would think that whatever the merits and demerits of the project, and as I said, that's not my field, that the government would know that if you are inviting or accepting the Chinese, then it's important to signal that you're not giving the Chinese preferential treatment or a kind of a quasi-monopolistic status. And the easiest way to do that is to maintain excellent relations with Japan, with which we have had excellent relations under all administrations. But it would seem from the news that's broken in Colombo over the last few days, the Auditor General's report, that the government pulled the plug from unilaterally from the Japanese project, and Japan has asked for a very large sum of payment in recompense. Now, those are the signals. The fact that we unceremoniously pull the plug on the Japanese project shows that there is no interest in any kind of demonstration of even-handedness. All the eggs, as I said, are in one basket. Now, it's not just economics. The ruling party, the Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna, SLPP, colloquially known as the Pohotua, because of the Nelum bud, the lotus bud, that is its symbol, had a virtual conference with high-ranking members of the Communist Party of China. And the Sri Lankan side was represented by two members of the Rajapaksa family. And they pledged to build up party-to-party relations. Now, that has never happened in Sri Lanka's political history. I mean, you had communist parties having very good relations with the Chinese Communist Party. That's understandable. But a mainstream democratic party, a governing party, which is not a left-wing party, to establish party-to-party relations and say that it will build up such relations with China indicates another dimension of the relationship, which had not existed before. So we are now no longer hedging, what Shalini calls hedging, I call non-alignment. We are bandwagoning at exactly the wrong time. Thank you.
Ambassador, we also have questions in the chat. If you had a chance to see,
I think
yeah,
two questions are directed to me. One is about investment law, and I would like to take up the question of Colombo Port City Economic Commission Act as well. right? So the first one is about the, yes, investment law is something this term I use. I don't know how many scholars agree with me or not, but I say, because I have seen, as a researcher in the field of international investment law, I have seen that throughout the history, foreign investment has certain downsides and certain advantages. So
It's gone up. Sorry.
There is some problem with the internet, I think.
Mm-mm.
Yeah, yeah.
It's
Now
going
you're
on.
on.
Yeah?
Yes.
regional
No, it's
political impacts directly and indirectly. But here, what I
okay.
see is
It's off again.
It's gone again. It's gone again. I think there are some internet issues. Tanisha, would you like to just see if there's a way we can address it? Maybe meanwhile, Ambassador, you could start with the question that's addressed to you
I, I,
from
I, I'm sorry, I couldn't see the question.
it's in the chat. The question is, at the moment, debt and economic malaise requires the island to turn towards the party with the deepest pockets. If so, what is your perspective of the posture Sri Lanka should adopt to recalibrate ties with India, USA, and China to fulfill its national interest?
Right, I just saw it. I just saw it.
Yes.
Yes, well, I think we learned a lesson in the 1980s. We had a high growth economy, 8% growth, when we opened up the economy decade before India did. India opened it up in 1991, we did in 1977. But within years, our economy went into a tailspin for extra economic reasons. Mismanagement of the internal ethnic relations, which also had an external dimension because of the spillover into Tamil Nadu and throughout the rest of the world. And also mismanagement of our external relations, where the government of that time in the 1980s made exactly the same mistake that this government is making. At that time, it was thought by Colombo that it had a special relationship with President Reagan of the United States and also Israel, which is the case even now. And therefore, it could ignore India's legitimate security concerns. So, this sounds a long answer, but what I'm saying is you cannot think in purely economic or economistic terms and say, okay, the Chinese have more money to offer than the other guys, so we are going with the Chinese. Because you may be setting off a chain reaction of threat perceptions and pushbacks, which uh, jeopardize your projected economic growth. In any case, we are not having much economic growth now, and it's not all because of COVID-19. I think that we have to be aware of the moves that we are making. I would say always bear in mind a multipolar approach, drawing as many players as possible into your investment plans. Be mindful of the concerns of other people, especially your neighbors. Always be aware of where you are located and who you are. A small island on India's doorstep with a multi-ethnic population. It doesn't mean that you have to be a client state, but you have to understand the parameters of prudence. And we have completely forgotten that. It's not only this administration, the immediately preceding administration swung in the other direction, in the West, to such an extent that one would think that they thought that we were located in the northwest quadrant of the world map. Just as this government seems to think that we are a neighbor of China, not India. So this unrealism is extremely damaging even to our economic prospects, and we always have to factor in the geostrategic into our development perspectives. We have, in short, we must have a holistic picture of who we are, what we're doing, what our real options are, and where we are headed.
Can I add one point? I think I echo Dr. Jaitiraka's points that we have to we um, in international relations sometimes we say like there are no permanent friends but permanent enemies, but then we have permanent location, we are not going to go somewhere else. We have sorry, we don't have permanent friends or enemies, but we have permanent interests, and but we have a permanent location that we are not going to go anywhere else. So I echo what Dr. Jaitiraka says. We have to, because India is our neighbor, so definitely we have to be sensitive to its security concerns, and it's vice versa. India also should think that in Sri Lanka is its neighbor, and Sri Lanka has its own security concerns when it comes to our foreign policy dealings. So, and also as a, adding to the point about this, how Sri Lanka can manage this when we want more money. I think Sri Lanka can take example from Southeast Asia. Southeast Asian countries have been going through this power struggle for so many years between United States and China, and they seem to be managing it quite well. The idea of strategic hedging actually in academic discourse, at least mostly discussed in terms of Southeast Asia. So Sri Lanka definitely has some examples out there where we can look at and see how we can do the same. We have done better in the past in our course of strategic hedging. I think moving forward also, if because what matters, what should be mattered mostly first and foremost is what Sri Lanka's interests are, and if the strategic hedging serves Sri Lanka's interest, and if we can benefit from it, I think that's what we should do.
Thank you. I think we can go back to Dr. Dilini now.
Yes, and
Sorry,
sorry for
we
the
lost you in the
interruption.
middle. Yes, we
Yes,
lost you
sorry
in
for
the
the
middle.
interruption. I
Yeah,
think I lost my
yeah,
connection. So we were
yeah.
talking about the investment law, the concept. I framed this situation as an investment law. I don't know how many how many scholars will agree with me, but what I see is when I'm researching on the Chinese investment in Sri Lanka, uh, particularly for my PhD studies, what I see was like when Sri Lanka was leased out the Hambantota port to the Chinese company because it was become a huge unprofitable venture, which was funded by the Chinese loan. Then immediately India expressed its willingness to invest in the Mattal International Airport, which was considered as the world's emptiest airport. There was so that's how framed because it was considered as at that time was emptiest airport. And then I was questioning myself about if India really want to get a profitable venture in Sri Lanka, why you invest in this kind of venture? What is the real purpose behind this? It's profitable motive, goal-oriented investment, or it is driven by non-commercial policy objectives to counter the China's balance in the southern part of the Sri Lanka. So I had this initial thoughts in my mind, which this is a tug of war between once you have one is investment, then you need another major power to counterbalance China's influence through another investment project. Because throughout the history, or economically, if we understand the phenomenon of investment, it is a profit-driven economic activity. So that's what my concern is. It's the same in these days. And look at what happened in the Colombo port. Once the south terminal is already operated by the Chinese company, and then India, Japan, and Sri Lanka entered into a agreement to develop the uh, East Container Terminal with the support of the Indian nominated Adani Group. Right? It's not an Indian. When it comes to Chinese investment, there is a lot of allegation that investment are driven by SOEs, state-owned enterprises. But even though this Indian company is not state-owned enterprises, it was nominated by the Indian government, if I am not mistaken, and if the available reports are correct. So then it became a huge political issue, which changed the general perception in Sri Lanka about the notion of foreign investment, because now people think that foreign investment, joint venture, or a special economic zones are the ways in which Sri Lanka just tosses away its national properties to the foreigners. That is the biggest question, because the perception is changing, because we get the deals wrong with the Colombo Port City project, initially agreeing to provide Chinese investor with freehold lands. So this investment created the idea, and it destroyed the trust and confidence among the general public about the foreign investment. Right? They think that this is a way you can give, or you can transfer national properties to the foreign investors. And once the Hambantota port is not profitable, we have to lease out. And it was framed by the nationalistic movement as the good governance government is administration is selling national properties to the China. So those concerns changed public perception, and then when it comes to this came to a peak when it comes to the developing the East Container Terminal in the Colombo port, and Adani Group was nominated by the Chinese by the Indian government, and it is became a huge problem. And then instead of East Container Terminal, then this company is given the opportunity to develop the West Container Terminal of the Colombo Port City as a joint venture. So what I see, and then it comes to the Colombo Port City project. It wanted to be create as a special economic zone, but it was framed as creating another territory within Sri Lanka. That is the most general understanding, because special economic zones are created to attract foreign investment, and as a matter of policy and law and policy, normal regulations applicable to the rest of the business operating in the territory of the country hosting the special economic zones are not applicable to those areas designated as special economic zones. So what happened through the port city bill was it releases the applicable of some of the laws to that designated area, but it was not a separate jurisdiction. It didn't create a separate jurisdiction which not entirely applied the Sri Lankan law. And if you look at the law and policy behind the special economic zone, that is how all the countries does. They create designated areas, and they have some liberalized regulations to induce the investment environment and thus designated special economic zones. So when it comes to India, what I think is once India want to involve in this project, which apparently says can be considered as driven by non-policy and I would say by policy objectives rather than economic objectives, it will get into this investment war, and people's perception would be changed, because one investment is given to India and the other investment is going to China. So they consider this as a way of selling Sri Lanka's national strategies to the big power who are competing each other for the influence in the Asia. So that is my first question, and this is something have to be in terms of India's policies and their strategic objectives as well. And when it comes to the Colombo Port City Act, there are a lot of misconception about that. Whether it's a part of Sri Lanka, whether it's a part of who has the territory or the sovereignty over that. But it's very clear in the Supreme Court judgment that Colombo Port City, that special economic zone, is a part of a Sri Lankan territory, and Sri Lanka has the sovereignty over that. So the only thing is, the national legislation which create the special economic zone have given have identified certain laws can be released from the applicable on that investment coming to that area in order to facilitate and give incentives to foreign investors. And there are some certain laws which are not applicable to the special economic zone, the Colombo Port City special economic zone, because there are laws, the factors that have been dealing with these laws have already dealt with the provisions in the Colombo Port City Act. So there can be an overlap. In order to avoid that overlap, certain laws have been released from applying the Colombo Port City projects. Rather than that, according to my understanding, is this create a special economic zone and a statutory body or a commission to govern the relationship with the investment relationship in that particular designated area. But most important thing is not the domestic legal framework, because the domestic framework can be changed at any time. If the next government is not happy with this legal arrangement, it can be amended. But the most important thing is Sri Lanka should get investment contracts right with the potential investors. Because what went wrong in the Colombo Port City initial legal agreement was Sri Lanka agreed to provide Chinese investor with a freehold land on a freehold basis, which went wrong. That is the biggest problem there. So it's very important. The national legislation can be changed or amended or repealed at any time, but investment contract is not that. You cannot change easily because it's a contract between the state and the investor. So it is very important that we carefully negotiate those investment contracts and get the terms and rights very correctly. Otherwise, this is going to be a huge problem, because I believe that there can be a lot of investment which will be coming to this port city in order to counter China's increased presence in this economic zone. So we have to be very careful as Sri Lanka when it comes to the selecting investment projects and creating the legal framework applicable to each investment project. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Delaney. I don't know if any of the other speakers would like to add to what you have said. Ambassador, Dr. Chilani, would any of you want to add something?
One thing I think what to me what Dr. Dilini explained is partly an issue of politicization of infrastructure or mega infrastructure investments in Sri Lanka as well as internationally. It is a trend that we see everywhere. So the infrastructure which initially were meant to help a country's economic growth now are seen as strategic assets where a powerful country is trying to sort of gain influence. So we in it has become a form of statecraft. So I think that is one of the major issues that's why we see that investment war and also polarized opinion in the public sphere as well as internationally. And for that, I also think that Sri Lanka is essentially very. One fact is Sri Lanka is becoming increasingly politically polarized. So when you see opinion about a particular infrastructure, you see two different perspectives based on the political opinion, which is not healthy, because you have, in my personal opinion, you have to look at it in an objective manner and to see the long term outcome of the infrastructure, because it's not going to infrastructure is not going to stay only for a 5-year period or a 10-year period within which a government is in power, or it's not like that. The other factor is that there is another interesting trend in Sri Lanka where there is a resistance to foreign investment um, throughout, like especially when the investment is coming with a component of privatization. We saw it in early 2000s, late 1990s, when part of Ceylon Petroleum Corporation, the Indian oil company came into Sri Lanka for investment. And there was huge protest within the public sector against this investment. But we see that today Sri Lanka's energy security has improved because of that. So I think because of the nature of polarization in the country, within the community, it has become extremely difficult to look at a project objectively and analyze it for this as a investment project, or as a for the economic component of it. So we get involved in the personal political opinion, that we sometimes lose these factors. As a result, sometimes we also don't see the issues with a particular infrastructure. So I think that is something we need to sort of like.
Yes, Ambassador. Ambassador.
Yes, I think we have to be careful here not to blame public opinion. Sri Lanka opened up its economy in 1977, and there was no public reaction against that. So I don't think that there's some kind of ingrained characteristic in the Sri Lankan ethos that resists foreign investment. It's just that as a small island, public opinion, the citizenry are very concerned about strategic assets and a perceived shrinkage of national economic space and control. So it's not an isolationist mentality, because as I said, we opened up the economy in 1977 and nobody's ever questioned the open economy except this government. And that's the second point I want to make. If there's economic irrationality in Sri Lanka today, that irrationality comes from the government, because at the same time that you have this wide open port city, you also have a policy of import bans. The banning of the importation of a number of items, including those which are agricultural and industrial inputs, not just luxury items. Today, there are farmers demonstrating because the government has imposed a ban on chemical fertilizer, and there's a looming agrarian crisis. So when the ruling elite gives mixed signals, it seems hypocritical. You ban the import of chemical fertilizer on a very nativist basis, but you have this wide open model of port city with the resultant vision of almost a socioeconomic apartheid, because the port city is a bubble. It will be, if it works, West Berlin, while the rest of the country is East Germany. And that is not a coherent picture. So you can't expect the public to think in terms of economic rationality when the government has a kind of a bipolar or schizophrenic economic vision. I think we have to understand that what the government does is mimicked again by public opinion, perhaps in another way. There's economic irrationality in response, but the irrationality is most glaring in the form of the government's own policies, because while everybody respects the idea of organic agriculture, that is something that should first have a pilot project in a district, and hundreds of PhDs have written in saying, don't do this. You're headed for a quasi-famine. But it's happening. And at the same time, you have this other model, and the Sri Lanka Investment Forum. an irony, a bitter irony, is that China, if we take the Communist Party of China, Mao Zedong described China at that time, pre-revolutionary China, as semi-colonial, semi-feudal. Now, why semi-colonial? Because it was not captured by any one imperialist power, but it had foreign spheres of influence, especially the so-called treaty ports. Today, Sri Lanka's port city seems pretty much like one of those treaty ports, and we are looking like the kind of semi-colonial formation that Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party fought against. This strange notion of the ports, the treaty ports, which are foreign enclaves. So it's a very surreal economic philosophy and economic situation. I'm not surprised that the public response is therefore polarized and polarizing.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I think once again you brought some very interesting, elements and aspects into the discussion, and your knowledge of history was quite apparent from what you said in your last remarks. I think we've had a very interesting discussion today. I still have, but unfortunately, I think Dr. Dilini is again having some internet problems. But I was not fully able to understand her, the issue that she raised about the east and west container terminals, and the Adani group being nominated versus the issue under discussion, because I don't think the kind of terms that have been offered to the Chinese for the project that we have been discussing this afternoon have been offered to anybody else, or for that matter, whether anybody else has had the kind of disaster like the Chinese had in Hambantota. So whether the experience of Hambantota actually would have led someone to start questioning this particular project or not, I think that would have, in that light, I don't see at all the parallel with the port terminal example that she gave. But unfortunately, she's not here with us, so she cannot respond anymore. I think we have a few more minutes, so if anybody would want to make any final comments before we wind up, and I say thank you to everyone. Would you like to say something, Dr. Chilani?
I think I agree. It was a very thought-provoking discussion, and I am honored to be in this panel. And also, I also learned a lot
Yes.
from our discussion.
So did
And
I.
yes, so
Me too.
well, I think all in all, the bottom line is that Sri Lanka will not be able to avoid the power struggle because of our geographical location. The power struggle is already there in the Indian Ocean, and we can't go and hide anywhere. So we have to find a way of dealing with it, mitigating the situation, and serve our interests as well. So it will depend on what policies we are making, how we are making it, and how we are implementing these policies. So I hope that in the long run that Sri Lanka will take lessons from its past, look around the neighbors, and look around to the other regions, and make the best out of it, because well, port city I think is going to be a game changer. It is going to be a game changer not just for Sri Lanka but for the entire region. So I hope that we make the best out of it.
Thank you so much,
Right.
Dr. Chilani. Ambassador, your final remarks.
Yes, thank you. The Chinese view seems to be that India at the moment is a paper tiger, preoccupied with COVID. But not only that, but, it lacks the will to counter China's moves in the Indian Ocean, and the Sri Lankan build-up is on India's southern doorstep in the Indian Ocean, and is therefore nothing but a power projection by China outside its traditional sphere of influence, and not only on India's northern tier, but now on its southern flank. Now that's a pretty serious phenomenon. And those of us who remember the annexures to the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord would recall that the hub, the pith and substance of those annexures was that Sri Lanka would not do anything together with extra-regional powers, which would go against India's legitimate security concerns in the region. Now, that's been totally forgotten. With, I would say, with strategic impunity. Now, whether the United States and India's other friends in the Quad would be concerned about this and wonder whether India should be more proactive towards the southern flank, and also on the issues of democracy, because there is this new dimension of democracy versus authoritarianism, and India, as the world's most populous democracy, is also a player in the game. Now, these are the larger ramifications and questions. It's a larger matrix in which our topic today, I think, has to be located. So I would just leave with raising those larger dimensions of the issue.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I don't think we could have had this discussion without the mention of the word COVID in it. In these days. Thank you so much, and we are really lucky that Dr. Dilini is also back. Would you like to make any final comments? I did have a question on your presentation, but I think we'll let that pass for now. Any
No,
final
it's fine
comments?
because what happened was that I have to change my place to get a better connection.
Okay.
Okay. So, no, I would like, because I have already mentioned what I have to say, but if you want, I would like to
Just
have your
final
question.
remarks.
Yes.
No, it's okay. Just make, because we are really now out of time. So
Okay.
we'll just,
My final remarks as an a researcher in international investment law. My background is a bit difficult from the political science and international relations. What I say is Sri Lanka's current situation provide a good, strong example to show that how foreign investment has become a foreign policy tool, becoming a foreign policy tool, which can be used against the small countries like Sri Lanka. So I think the countries like Sri Lanka should have aware about the geopolitical impact and significance of infrastructure in critical industries and strategic sectors such as infrastructure and other sort of strategic industries. So that is the must. We have to be, as Sri Lanka, we have to be very careful about that, because it's not all about money and investment, because some political agendas could be behind that. So we have to have some sort of mechanism to screen these foreign investment against national security threats. And because under the international law, no country is compelled to accept foreign investment from any other country. It's up to your sovereignty to decide what kind of investment you want, what kind of investment, what kind of conditions you have to made upon the acceptance of this investment proposal. I think Sri Lanka have to very careful about selecting the relevant investment project and the relevant investors, as well as the way of funding these critical infrastructure projects, whether it should be a loans or direct investment or any kind of public private partnership. So Sri Lanka have to be very careful about that, rather than putting blaming on others. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I think we have done very well on time. We are just a short while left for the seminar. I think with that, let me uh, pass the microphone on to Tanisha. But before I do, let me thank our three eminent panelists, Ambassador Jay Talika, Dr. Chulani, Dr. Dilini. It has been a pleasure, a great pleasure talking with you. And I must say that it has been an extremely educative afternoon talking with all three of you. Thank you so much for your views. Tanisha,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you to all the distinguished speakers for joining this international seminar on Chinese involvement in Sri Lanka organized by Tillotoma Foundation. And a special thanks to Ambassador Ruchi Ghanshyam for being such a brilliant chair. Thanks to all the viewers from across the world. And we look forward to having you on future occasions. Thank you.